Section 5 of the Three Impostors by Arthur Machen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Novel of the Dark Valley, Part 2. I crawled home like a wounded beast and lay down on my bed. It was all a hopeless puzzle to me. I knew nothing but rage and shame and terror, and I suffered little more when I passed by a house in an adjacent valley, and some children who were playing outside ran from me shrieking. I was forced to walk to find some occupation. I should have died if I had sat down quietly in Blue Rock Park and looked all day at the mountains. But whenever I saw a human being, I saw the same glance of hatred and aversion, and once, as I was crossing a thick brake, I heard a shot, and the venomous hiss of a bullet close to my ear. One day I heard a conversation which astounded me. I was sitting behind a rock resting, and two men came along the track and halted. One of them had got his feet entangled in some wild vines and swore fiercely, but the other laughed and said they were useful things sometimes. What the hell do you mean? Oh, nothing much, but they're uncommon tough, these here vines, and sometimes rope is scarce and dear. The man who had sworn chuckled at this, and I heard them sit down and light their pipes. Have you seen him lately? Asked the humorist. I sighted him the other day, but the darn bullet went high. He's got his master's luck, I expect, sir, but it can't last much longer. You heard about him going to Jinks and trying his brass, but the young Britisher downed him pretty considerable, I can tell you. What the devil's the meaning of it? I don't know, but I believe it'll have to be finished, and done in the old style, too. You know how they fix the niggers? Yes, sir, I've seen a little of that. Couple of gallons of kerosene'll cost $1 at Brown's store, but I should say it's cheap anyway. They moved off after this, and I lay still behind the rock, the sweat pouring down my face. I was so sick that I could barely stand, and I walked home as slowly as an old man, leaning on my stick. I knew that the two men had been talking about me, and I knew that some terrible death was in store for me. That night I could not sleep. I tossed on the rough bed and tortured myself to find out the meaning of it all. At last, in the very dead of night, I rose from the bed and put on my clothes and went out. I did not care where I went, but I felt that I must walk till I tired myself out. It was a clear moonlight night, and in a couple of hours I found I was approaching a place of dismal reputation in the mountains, a deep cleft in the rocks known as Black Gulf Canyon. Many years before, an unfortunate party of Englishmen and Englishwomen had camped here and had been surrounded by Indians. They were captured, outraged, and put to death with almost inconceivable tortures, and the roughest of the trappers or woodsmen gave the canyon a wide berth, even in the daytime. As I crushed through the dense brushwood which grew above the canyon, I heard voices, and wondering who could be in such a place at such a time, I went on, walking more carefully, and making as little noise as possible. There was a great tree growing on the very edge of the rocks, and I lay down and looked out from behind the trunk. Black Gulf Canyon was below me, the moonlight shining bright into its very depths from mid-heaven, and casting shadows as black as death from the pointed rock, and all the sheer rock on the other side, overhanging the canyon, was in darkness. At intervals a light veil obscured the moonlight as a filmy cloud fleeted across the moon, and a bitter wind blew shrill across the gulf. I looked down, as I have said, and saw 20 men standing in a semicircle round a rock. I counted them one by one, and knew most of them. They were the very vilest of the vile, more vile than any den in London could show, and there was murder, worse than murder, on the heads of not a few. Facing them and me stood Mr. Smith, with the rock before him, and on the rock was a great pair of scales, such as are used in the stores. I heard his voice ringing down the canyon as I lay beside the tree, and my heart turned cold as I heard it. 'Life for gold!' he cried. 'A life for gold! The blood and the life of an enemy for every pound of gold!' A man stepped out and raised one hand, and with the other flung a bright lump of something into the pan of the scales, which clanged down, and Smith muttered something in his ear. Then he cried again, 'Blood for gold! For a pound of gold the life of an enemy, for every pound of gold upon the scales a life!' One by one the men came forward, each lifting up his right hand, and the gold was weighed in the scales, and each time Smith leant forward and spoke to each man in his ear. Then he cried again, 'Desire and lust for gold on the scales, for every pound of gold enjoyment of desire.' I saw the same thing happen as before, the uplifted hand and the metal weighed, and the mouth whispering, and black passion on every face. Then, one by one, I saw the men again step up to Smith. A muttered conversation seemed to take place. I could see that Smith was explaining and directing, and I noticed that he gesticulated a little as one who points out the way, and once or twice he moved his hands quickly, as if he would show the path was clear and could not be missed. I kept my eyes so intently on his figure that I noted little else, and at last it was with a start that I realized that the canyon was empty. A moment before I thought I had seen the group of villainous faces, and the two standing a little apart by the rock. I had looked down a moment, and when I glanced again into the canyon, there was no one there. In dumb terror I made my way home, and I fell asleep in an instant from exhaustion. No doubt I should have slept on for many hours, but when I woke up the sun was only rising, and the light shone in on my bed. I had started up from sleep with the sensation of having received a violent shock, and as I looked in confusion about me, I saw to my amazement that there were 3 men in the room. One of them had his hand on my shoulder and spoke to me. 'Come, mister, wake up. Your time's up now, I reckon, and the boys are waiting for you outside, and they're in a big hurry. Come on, you can put on your clothes. It's kind of chilly this morning.' I saw the other 2 men smiling sourly at each other, but I understood nothing. I simply pulled on my clothes and said I was ready. 'All right, come on then. You go first, Nichols, and Jim and I will give the gentleman an arm.' They took me out into the sunlight, and then I understood the meaning of a dull murmur that had vaguely perplexed me while I was dressing. There were about 200 men waiting outside, and some women too, and when they saw me there was a low muttering growl. I did not know what I had done, but that noise made my heart beat, and the sweat come out on my face. I saw confusedly, as through a veil, the tumult and tossing of the crowd. Discordant voices were speaking, and among all those faces there was not one glance of mercy, but a fury of lust that I did not understand. I found myself presently walking in a sort of procession up the slope of the valley, and on every side of me there were men with revolvers in their hands. Now and then a voice struck me, and I heard words and sentences of which I could form no connected story. but I understood that there was one sentence of execration. I heard scraps of stories that seemed strange and improbable. Someone was talking of men lured by cunning devices from their homes and murdered with hideous tortures, found writhing like wounded snakes in dark and lonely places, only crying for someone to stab them in the heart, and so end their anguish. And I heard another voice speaking of innocent girls who had vanished for a day or two, and then had come back and died blushing red with shame, even in the agonies of death. I wondered what it all meant, and what was to happen, but I was so weary that I walked on in a dream, scarcely longing for anything but sleep. At last we stopped. We had reached the summit of a hill overlooking Blue Rock Valley, and I saw that I was standing beneath a clump of trees where I had often sat. I was in the midst of a ring of armed men, and I saw that 2 or 3 men were very busy with piles of wood, while others were fingering a rope. Then there was a stir in the crowd, and a man was pushed forward. His hands and feet were tightly bound with cord, and though his face was unutterably villainous, I pitied him for the agony that worked his features and twisted his lips. I knew him. He was amongst those that had gathered round Smith in Black Gulf Canyon. In an instant he was unbound and stripped naked, borne beneath one of the trees, and his neck encircled by a noose that went around the trunk. A hoarse voice gave some kind of order. There was a rush of feet, and the rope tightened, and there before me I saw the blackened face, and the writhing limbs, and the shameful agony of death. One after another, 6 men, all of whom I had seen in the canyon the night before, were strangled before me, and their bodies were flung forth on the ground. Then there was a pause, and the man who had roused me a short while before came up to me and said, "Now, mister, it's your turn. We give you 5 minutes to cast up your accounts, and when that's clocked, by the living God, we will burn you alive at that tree." It was then I awoke and understood. I cried out, "Why, what have I done? Why should you hurt me? I am a harmless man. I never did you any wrong. I covered my face with my hands, it seemed so pitiful, and it was such a terrible death." "What have I done?" I cried again. "You must take me for some other man. You cannot know me." "You black-hearted devil," said the man at my side, "we know you well enough. There's not a man within 30 miles of this that won't curse Jack Smith when you are burning in hell." "My name's not Smith," I said, with some hope left in me. "My name is Wilkins. I was Mr Smith's secretary, but I knew nothing of him." "Hark at the black liar," said the man. "Secretary be damned! You were clever enough, I dare say, to slink out at night and keep your face in the dark, but we've tracked you out at last. But your time's up. Come along." I was dragged to the tree and bound to it with chains. I saw the piles of wood heaped all about me, and shut my eyes. Then I felt myself drenched all over with some liquid, and looked again, and a woman grinned at me. She had just emptied a great can of petroleum over me and over the wood. A voice shouted, "Fire away!" and I fainted, and knew nothing more. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on a bed in a bare, comfortless room. A doctor was holding some strong salts to my nostrils, and a gentleman standing by the bed, whom I afterwards found to be the sheriff, addressed me. "Say, mister," he began, "you've had an uncommon narrow squeak for it. The boys were just about lighting up when I came along with the posse, and I had as much as I could do to bring you off, I can tell you. And mind you, I don't blame them. They had made up their minds, you see, that you were the head of the Black Gulf gang, and at first nothing I could say would persuade 'em that you weren't Jack Smith. Luckily, a man from here named Evans that came along with us allowed he had seen you with Jack Smith, and that you were yourself. So we brought you along and jailed you. But you can go if you like, when you're through with this faint turn.' I got on the cars the next day, and in 3 weeks I was in London again, almost penniless. But from that time my fortune seemed to change. I made influential friends in all directions. Bank directors courted my company, and editors positively flung themselves into my arms. I had only to choose my career, and after a while I determined that I was meant by nature for a life of comparative leisure. With an ease that seemed almost ridiculous, I obtained a well-paid position in connection with a prosperous political club. I have charming chambers in a central neighbourhood close to the parks. The club chef exerts himself when I lunch or dine, and the rarest vintages in the cellar are always at my disposal. Yet, since my return to London, I have never known a day's security or peace. I tremble when I awake, lest Smith should be standing at my bed, and every step I take seems to bring me nearer to the edge of the precipice. Smith, I knew, had escaped free from the raid of the vigilantes, and I grew faint at the thought that he would in all probability return to London, and that suddenly and unprepared I should meet him face to face. Every morning as I left my house I would peer up and down the street, expecting to see that dreaded figure awaiting me. I have delayed at street corners, my heart in my mouth, sickening at the thought that a few quick steps might bring us together. I could not bear to frequent the theatres or music halls, lest by some bizarre chance he should prove to be my neighbour. Sometimes I've been forced against my will to walk out at night, and then in silent squares the shadows have made me shudder, and in the medley of meetings in the crowded thoroughfares I have said to myself, it must come sooner or later. He will surely return to London, and I shall see him when I feel most secure. I scanned the newspapers for hint or intimation of approaching danger, and no small type nor report of trivial interest was allowed to pass unread. Especially I read and reread the advertisement columns, but without result. Months passed by, and I was undisturbed till, though I felt far from safe, I no longer suffered from the intolerable oppression of instant and ever-present terror. This afternoon, as I was walking quietly along Oxford Street, I raised my eyes and looked across the road, and then at last I saw the man who had so long haunted my thoughts. Mr Wilkins finished his wine and leant back in his chair, looking sadly at Dyson, and then, as if a thought struck him, fished out of an inner pocket a leather letter case, and handed a newspaper cutting across the table. Dyson glanced closely at the slip, and saw that it had been extracted from the columns of an evening paper. It ran as follows: Wholesale lynching, shocking story. A Dotseal telegram from Reading, Colorado, states that advices received there from Blue Rock Park report a frightful instance of popular vengeance. For some time the neighbourhood has been terrorized by the crimes of a gang of desperadoes who, under the cover of a carefully planned organization, have perpetrated the most infamous cruelties on men and women. A vigilance committee was formed, and it was found that the leader of the gang was a person named Smith, living in Blue Rock Park. Action was taken, and 6 of the worst in the band were summarily strangled in the presence of 200 or 300 men and women. Smith is said to have escaped. "This is a terrible story," said Dyson. "I can well believe that your days and nights are haunted by such fearful scenes as you have described. But surely you have no need to fear Smith. He has much more cause to fear you. Consider, you have only to lay your information before the police, and a warrant would be immediately issued for his arrest. Besides, you will, I am sure, excuse me for what I am going to say." "My dear sir," said Mr Wilkins, I hope you will speak to me with perfect freedom.' 'Well, then, I must confess that my impression was that you were rather disappointed at not being able to stop the man before he drove off. I thought you seemed annoyed that you could not get across the street.' 'Sir, I did not know what I was about. I caught sight of the man, but it was only for a moment, and the agony you witnessed was the agony of suspense. I was not perfectly certain of the face, and the horrible thought that Smith was again in London overwhelmed me. I shuddered at the idea of this incarnate fiend, whose soul is black with shocking crimes, mingling free and unobserved amongst the harmless crowds, meditating perhaps a new and more fearful cycle of infamies. I tell you, sir, that an awful being stalks through the streets, a being before whom the sunlight itself should blacken, and the summer air grow chill and dank. Such thoughts as these rushed upon me with the force of a whirlwind. I lost my senses.' 'I see. I partly understand your feelings, but I would impress on you that you have nothing really to fear. Depend upon it, Smith will not molest you in any way. You must remember he himself has had a warning, and indeed, from the brief glance I had of him, he seemed to me to be a frightened looking man. However, I see it is getting late, and if you will excuse me, Mr Wilkins, I think I will be going. I dare say we shall often meet here.' Dyson walked off smartly, pondering the strange story chance had brought him, and finding on cool reflection that there was something a little strange in Mr Wilkins' manner, for which not even so weird a catalogue of experiences could altogether account. End of Novel of the Dark Valley.